What's up? Welcome back to Nowstalgia. Dave here with a review of Superman, the first film in the new DC universe being run and managed by James Gunn and Peter Safran over at Warner Brothers. Of course, this is the latest iteration of Superman on the big screen. Not too long ago, since we saw Henry Cavill's edition with the DCEU, and although we had the various team-up movies from Zack Snyder, we only ever had one Superman solo film from that whole misbegotten era of DC storytelling. And of course, that was Man of Steel, which came out way back in 2013. It's been 12 years since the last Superman film, a longer run than you had to wait between Batman Returns and Man of Steel. Wild that it took this long to get here. But of course, so much is riding on Superman 2025 because this is the film that's kicking off this new era of DC storytelling and needs to land successfully, I think, as a film, and it needs to be a good movie on its own, but also be good enough and convincing enough as a launching pad for this new universe, this rebooting of the franchise, of course. And it's coming at an interesting time with, of course, the general superhero malaise that we are in, with Marvel on the downswing, even seeing a movie that was well regarded like Thunderbolts not perform particularly impressively. There's an opportunity for Superman, which is tracking to open very big, to maybe engender a lot of goodwill and excitement about DC storytelling for the first time. And we reflect on what happens, and not to relitigate too much, but the DCEU era was really felled by changes of management and priorities. Of course, who owned Warner Brothers changed during that time. The introduction of the race to the bottom with streaming, of course, with HBO Max factored in towards the end. And ultimately, the films proved divisive. And it's not totally surprising that part of that happened with Superman, because Superman is a difficult character to get right. Not dissimilar for Marvel with Captain America, but I think Marvel was lucky enough to have cast it perfectly with Chris Evans and factor Cap in with a lot of supporting characters, because the MCU was really humming at that time and was able to really buoy a character that's not particularly interesting all the time on its own. Superman, I think the Henry Cavill performance of Superman was pretty well liked, even if where that character was being taken in the DCEU, which was really playing into the alienation factor of Superman, the person, Superman, the character, the idea, that maybe didn't prove as convincing to everyone. Now we're struck with, where do you take Superman? How do you approach it? And I think Gunn's approach here made a lot of sense, because this is a film that is eschewing the traditional origin story. And that, of course, the one that everyone known for decades at this point, Kal-El, sent away from his home planet of Krypton by his parents before his planet is no more, crash lands in Kansas and is raised as a human despite not actually being one, right? People know that, right? It's very similar to the Batman origin story, the Spider-Man origin story. And Gunn has said that we do not need to have those anymore. Now, whether you agree about whether we should actually see those ever again, I do think the choice to eschew all that with Superman 2025 is very similar to how Marvel introduced Spider-Man for its own purposes. Of course, a character that we had seen through the Sony iterations a lot of times, but when it finally came due to have Tom Holland have his own movie in the MCU, and of course Spider-Man Homecoming, he was already Spider-Man when we watched that movie. And having Superman this time around not only already be Superman, but already be publicly out as the hero that he is, already be dating Lois Lane, already be hated by Lex Luthor. It just really feels like we get more towards the good stuff by skipping ahead of the stuff that's pretty familiar and rote. Overall, I really enjoyed Superman 2025. I think this film is an effective reintroduction of the Superman character and a surprisingly successful launching point for future DC storytelling. It is certainly a movie that has a lot to it, many ancillary characters, many threads that didn't necessarily need to be here, but the movie moves at a brisk enough pace and somehow doesn't feel overstuffed despite being a movie that's not too much longer than 2 hours. You're not going to find the gravitas, the stoicism that you got from Henry Cavill. This is a much more earnest portrayal of Kal-El and Clark Kent. David Corenswet's performance is almost leaning into the dorkiness of Superman and playing that up for laughs, but the tone of the movie remains consistent. The movie is able to really get to the conflict of Superman that can often be hard to express, which is the humanity within the non-human. And thankfully, Rachel Brosnahan is here as Lois Lane, who leaps off the screen. She's really tremendous and has great chemistry with Corenswet. And Nicholas Hoult continues the great run he's been on as a very compelling Lex Luthor. Now, because the movie has so much going on, and we'll get into what that really means, I don't think this is a movie that's able to like transcend the genre or anything like that. Like, this is not like one of the like all-time great superhero films. But given all that was riding on this movie and all the things it's had to accomplish, which is again reintroduce Superman as a cinematic character, be a successful launching point for the DC franchise, and in the process of achieving that second goal, introduce a lot of other threads and other characters that will be picked up later outside of Superman's storytelling. Really, it checked all those boxes. So maybe you could have made a better movie with less of those goals. But for a movie that had all of these goals, I think it really works. And, you know, we associate like a certain irreverence with James Gunn's filmmaking, of course, between the 3 Guardians movies, the Suicide Squad for the DCEU. He likes to bring in a zany factor, right? And with Superman 2025, I mean, shit, you have a Superman movie kicking off a new franchise, a total reboot here, and in the process we get the Justice Gang featuring Green Lantern, Hawkgirl, and Mr. Terrific. I mean, that's not a choice everyone would make, but I think for the most part those characters fit into the story. Obviously they're extraneous, but you know, I think they're fun introductions. And I think the idea, the decision there to have Superman and pair him up, contrast him against his other superpowered peers, you know, and ideally like peers, allies, not just his villains that are also superpowered. It does a good job of showing you who Superman is himself and why he's different and why he's the best of us and all those traditional Superman tropes. You know, Nathan Fillion as Guy Gardner, one of the, of course, the Green Lanterns, not the most famous Green Lantern, of course, but one of the Green Lanterns, and Isabella Merced as Hawkgirl. You know, Merced doesn't have a whole lot to really do as Hawkgirl. I guess remains to be seen what to make of her portrayal. Obviously, she's a rapidly rising actor between Alien Romulus and The Last of Us. Fillion, of course, someone who has been talked about as Green Lantern character, talked about as someone who could play Uncharted's Nathan Drake back in the day, finally getting like a big high profile, you know, role to play in a franchise film where it's his own face and not like voice work or anything like that. And he gets like Guy Gardner, who's, you know, the third most famous of the Green Lanterns. His sense of comedy and timing with his comedy, I think, is a nice bit of levity within this film. And I'll be looking forward to seeing him on HBO's Lanterns next year and seeing him play off Kyle Chandler, who's playing Hal Jordan, and Aaron Pierre, who's playing John Stewart, of course, the 2 most famous Green Lantern characters. So looking forward to that. I was not expecting, of all the Justice Gang characters, that Edie Gaethje's Mr. Terrific would not only be the biggest role in the movie, but it would be coming from the least famous of those 3 characters and the least famous of those 3 actors. But he's really good as a character. I don't think is super well known. Like, I don't really know too much about Mr. Terrific as you know, someone who doesn't read too many DC comics. But that was I really enjoyed him, and he has a lot going on. Like, he has like solo scenes in this movie, and I think maybe to some people that kind of stuff, that much time away from Superman and Lois, would probably be a step too far for them, and maybe to some people that would feel overstuffed. I did think overall for me it was working in the movie. I did really like the central conflict between Superman and Lex Luthor, and Lex Luthor's, you know, various geopolitical machinations as a part of his, you know, quest, obsession with taking down Sup. You know, I think think about what Holt's been up to lately. I mean, last year he had 3 great performances in The Order and Nosferatu and Juror Number 2, going right into this where he gets to really like play it up, play into like the psychotic sensibilities that Luthor has, but still very convincingly being like the smartest man in the world, the smartest guy in the room, all those things you associate with Lex. And it's manic, but still more in the traditional line of what we associate Lex Luthor for. It's not quite as far afield as Jesse Eisenberg's portrayal, which I appreciated for being something kind of different. But this is more in line with what you associate Lex Luthor with, and I think Holt really nailed it. And he has a big presence in the movie as him and all his allies and his companies and his goons, his superpowered goons and whatnot. They have a big factor in a lot of plot movement. And you get the big reveal at the end that one of his minions is in fact like Bizarro. Was not expecting Bizarro Superman in this movie as well. And I think it's probably one of the least impactful like character introductions, if you can call Bizarro a character, but like least impactful character introductions in the movie, because it happens really just in the third act. Like it doesn't really matter too much when he's in his masked like Ultraman form. Earlier on, he's just a goon. But yeah, overall, I was pretty interested in Lex because I like that the conflict was already like well underway when the movie starts, and the movie gives you like these series of title cards telling you about Superman landed here 30 years ago, introduced himself to the world 3 months ago, stopped a war 3 days ago, and then lost his first fight unknowingly to Bizarro like 3 hours ago, and then we watch him crash land near the Fortress of Solitude, all wounded for the first time. Like I really like that, like jumping us right in, and before you know it, like Lex's minion is already scoping out the fortress to find a way in. Speaking to like kind of like the zaniness and the tone with this movie, the super dog Crypto, who is actually Supergirl's dog. Crypto has a big role in the movie throughout. To be honest, I was not expecting that. It's a lot of dog humor, but it's fun. It's amusing. It's also nice to spend time, small time, but like time with the extended like Daily Planet crew besides Lois Lane. Skylar Gisondo actually has a pretty sizable supporting role as Jimmy Olsen, which was amusing, and Lois gets to do stuff out on her own, has a bit of a side quest in support of Superman and in search of Superman with Mr. Terrific. Like, again, not something you would have expected. But I think, like, if there's one thing to, like, point to with this movie, like, the most successful scene in this movie is so clearly, it's towards the beginning. It's this interview scene that Lois and Clark have in Lois's apartment. And watching Lois be a beast as an interviewer, as a journalist, and seeing Clark begin to crack as his motives and his decision making is questioned, because he's someone who's so one track in his desire to do good that he is struggling to ascertain why someone wouldn't see things the way he sees them. And it's a really crackling scene, speaks to the great chemistry that they had that continues throughout the movie. I think a scene like that really stands out among most superhero storytelling, just because I think it's really well paced and just really great dialogue. And to me, that's a scene that's probably more memorable than any of the set pieces. It is a movie that eventually descends into, kind of like a garish CGI world, which is this, I forget the terminology they're using in the movie, this like pocket universe, was it? One of part of the grand scheme of Luthor, where he has all his enemies trapped in this like middle nether realm that ultimately ends up being the cause of the third act destruction that these movies often must have. So you spend some time in that nether realm, which is pretty dark, and then there's this kind of chase/survival scene involving this like proton river of neon colors and things like that, and a manifestation of a black hole. I don't think any of that was like super visually engaging. Like it's especially watching Superman like fight like Luthor's like flying superpowered, or not superpowered, like jetpack goons. nothing super great. Although at that point you get the introduction to Anthony Carrigan's character, was it Metamorpho, who is, I think, a fun supporting character here again. Anthony Carrigan, of course, of Barry fame. Nice performance. You get a little bit of his humor at the very end there. His inclusion, though, I think makes a lot of sense to the story, in terms of how he's used by Luthor to subjugate Superman for a time, and it's probably something you could have predicted. It's a kind of a key Superman Lex beat. What goes on? I think it still works. And again, at the end, you have that third act, this destruction of Metropolis due to Luthor's machinations, and a lot of buildings being destroyed. A lot of really almost like on the nose shots throughout the movie of Superman saving kids and saving a squirrel from being crushed and all kinds of things like that. And he's super motivated to make sure his dog gets rescued, even though it's actually not really even his dog, but he feels bad for the dog being alone, so he must turn himself in to get to it, right? Like a lot of like kind of gratuitous stuff there, but speaking the ethos of Superman. But that third act, destruction, you like throw in Soup fighting Bizarro, and you're not super like invested in that as a conflict, right? But of course, this is always like the push-pull with Lex Luthor's Superman storytelling, because Superman's very rarely going to be fighting Lex, and like Lex is in like some kind of like souped up suit of some kind, which he has been from time to time in storytelling. But to find some other way, but you're just not super invested in watching him fight Bizarro. I think it is fun though to have Lex like being like controlling Bizarro's movements, and they have all these moves planned out, and he's literally like playing Bizarro like a controller. So thus he's fighting Superman, by proxy. That's what like takes it to the next level. But yeah, are any of those individual set pieces as engaging as the interview scene? They're not. So that'd be like my biggest note, I guess. But again, I think for what this movie set to accomplish, introducing a successful Superman character, Corenswet definitely does a good job, and the movie does a good job of portraying this character again. Check. Launch point for the franchise. It would have been one just on its own, but they have a lot of supporting DC characters, as we talked about here. In the actual runtime of the movie at the end, we see Millie Alcock's Supergirl. Supergirl will be the next DCU film in a year's time, in June of next year. They make a point of pointing her out, having her come collect her dog. So like, it's a great launch point, because we're directly teeing off the Lanterns HBO show, directly teeing off next year's Supergirl film, other characters introduced to the board, people that could come up again, like Frank Grillo's, Argus leader character, Rick Flag Sr., he was a voice in Creature Commandos, that animated show they already made in this franchise, this universe that didn't get remarked upon too much. Like they're doing it. They're really filling in the world already. So like that worked. And just as a movie, I do think it's a successful movie, even if it would have been a better movie with less of these franchise aspirations. So I think that's probably the biggest sticking point someone would have with this, is that there's just too much ancillary things going on. But I think to me, they come together well enough, and the movie isn't like overly long, that it didn't feel like super extraneous to me. So I was pretty entertained by it. And, I'm hopeful about this era of DC, just because it feels like there's someone with their hands on the wheel. And whether James Gunn ends up being the right person to have their hands on the wheel, at least there's someone involved right now, right? Like even the DCEU was not really in the Snyder's vision, whether you like Snyder or hate Snyder. Of course, there's many people that are in those camps. It was taken away from Zack, even if it was ever in his hands in the first place. And again, all that management continued to change and priorities continued to change, right? Now that we have Gunn and Safran emboldened, and Warner Brothers and simply Warner Brothers Discovery, the owner, they are embattled in a point that they need their franchises cooking. So like, Gunn and Safran have been deputized and empowered to make this work. So we'll see how their vision goes, right? Like obviously the slate they unveiled, it's not exactly traditional, right? It's not like there's a Justice League movie dated, right? There's not a Wonder Woman movie dated. It's in early development. Batman is in a kind of strange place right now where you have a Batman movie they're apparently still developing, separate from the next Batman film from Matt Reeves starring Robert Pattinson, which apparently is still in the writing phase and is continuing to be delayed and delayed. So that kind of like leftover nature of things that might rear its ugly head at some point. We'll see. The first Batman was very good, so I'm hopeful. But like, it is kind of amusing that Supergirl will be followed up with Clayface, written by Mike Flanagan. And you wouldn't think of starting a DC universe with two Superman adjacent movies and then Clayface, right? It's atypical. So we'll see how it works. But I think Superman's going to be big. And it's been pretty well regarded. We'll see how that continues as more of the public sees the movie. But I'm hopeful. And, you know, think of like before Gunn got involved, right? Like the movies we were seeing, right? Like towards the end. And I guess he got involved around this time, but like Aquaman 2, Shazam 2, like the DCU EU went out with such a whimper, both in terms of audience interest and just poor film quality, you know? So it just feels good to like have some hope again. And am I expecting this to be like, you know, the Infinity Saga of the MCU and have like massive audience investment? No. But I think general interest and positive vibes is a good place to start. And I think that's where we're at. So let me know, what'd you think of James Gunn's Superman? What'd you like most about the movie? Are you excited for the new DCU to continue? Let me know. And for more movie reviews, subscribe. And I'll see you next time.